The massive trade hub was alive with sound and color, a place where merchants from hundreds of species gathered to exchange goods, rare treasures, and even beings that were considered too dangerous or valuable to be left in freedom. The auction house was the grand center of this hub, its chamber filled with glowing lights and countless voices whispering in dozens of tongues, all waiting for the next spectacle. The crowd had been loud and eager until now, but when the announcer raised his hand and declared the words, "The final lot," silence rolled through the hall like a wave. Every head turned toward the stage as the lights dimmed, leaving only a single spotlight shining on the platform. A tall, silver-clad guard stepped forward, pulling the chains of the figure that followed, and when she emerged, a murmur rippled through the crowd. She was unlike anything most had ever seen, a young alien girl, tall and graceful, her skin faintly luminous under the lights, eyes burning with a defiant fire that refused to be dimmed. Her wrists and ankles were bound with gleaming restraints that hummed with energy, yet she stood tall, refusing to bow her head. The announcer's voice boomed, practiced and theatrical, as he introduced her to the eager audience. "Behold, the Untamable one," he declared, drawing out the words so they echoed across the chamber. "No master has ever claimed her successfully. No chain has kept her subdued. She is fire. She is storm. She is danger itself. And tonight, you have the chance to own what no one else could." His words carried both excitement and warning, and the crowd leaned forward with mixed feelings of greed and unease. For a long moment, no one moved. The girl's gaze swept the chamber like a predator scanning prey, and wherever her eyes landed, many flinched or looked away. She was not broken like the others who had been paraded before her. She radiated an energy that unsettled even the boldest bidders. Her reputation had preceded her. Rumors of failed attempts to subdue her, of masters who had tried force only to be outwitted or humiliated. Whispers spread quickly among the audience, their voices low but urgent. Some called her dangerous, others a curse, and some dared to think she was an opportunity beyond measure. Yet hesitation lingered. The auctioneer, sensing the crowd's reluctance, smiled in a way that suggested he enjoyed the tension more than the sale itself. "You hesitate," he said, gesturing to the girl, who stood with her head high, her violet eyes sharp and unyielding. "And you should. She is no simple prize. She will not bow to cruelty or cage. But think, ladies and gentlemen, of the prestige, the power, the legend that comes with taming the untamable. Who among you has the courage to try?" The silence that followed was heavier than before. A few paddles twitched upward only to fall back to laps. Wealthy traders who had spent fortunes moments earlier now stared at the floor, unwilling to gamble on something they could not control. A reptilian merchant whispered to his neighbor that the last master who bought her nearly lost his entire estate trying to keep her bound. A noble with jeweled robes muttered that she would be more trouble than treasure. Still, eyes stayed locked on her, fascinated in spite of fear. The girl shifted slightly under the spotlight, and though her restraints glowed with energy, it seemed as if she could break them if she truly wished. Her chin tilted upward, a silent challenge to all who watched. Her defiance was not only in her posture but in the unspoken words written across her expression. "You may buy me, but you will never own me." The announcer let the moment stretch, playing with the crowd's nerves before slamming his cane against the platform. "Shall we begin?" he cried, his voice echoing with false cheer. "The final lot, opening bid." Yet as he called for numbers, the room remained hesitant and the bidding began at a sluggish pace. A few offered half-hearted sums, quickly backing down when challenged by a rival or when the girl's fierce eyes locked on them. For the first time that night, the auctioneer struggled to keep momentum. He raised his arms dramatically, his voice growing sharper, trying to stir greed into bravery. "Do not let fear rob you of greatness. She is the rarest of prizes, the jewel of defiance. To claim her is to claim immortality in memory." But still, paddles remained low. The audience was captivated, yes, but unwilling to commit themselves. The girl, noticing their cowardice, allowed the faintest smirk to curve her lips, as if she enjoyed their fear, as if she was the one in control rather than the one in chains. The tension in the chamber thickened, and the announcer's confidence began to falter. This was supposed to be the grand finale, the sale that would outshine all others, yet the fear of her reputation had silenced the richest voices in the hall. For a moment it seemed she might go unsold, return to the shadows until another stage could present her again. But the hush that fell was different this time, expectant, as if something was about to shift. The girl's eyes scanned the crowd, once more, meeting the gaze of creature after creature who quickly averted their eyes. Then she paused, her stare catching on someone who had not looked away. Somewhere in the crowd, one figure remained calm, watching her not with greed or fear but with an unreadable stillness. That subtle change in the air drew the attention of others, and whispers began again, softer but tinged with curiosity. It was as if the entire chamber leaned toward the moment, waiting to see who would break the silence. The announcer, sensing the weight of anticipation, lifted his cane again and declared, "This is your last chance. The untamable one will not wait forever. Who dares to claim her?" The words hung in the air, vibrating against the silence that followed. The alien girl stood proud beneath the lights, her restraints gleaming, her defiance brighter than ever, and still no paddle rose. The hush deepened, the crowd frozen, until the sound of a chair scraping across the floor broke through. All eyes swung in the same direction, the spotlight quivering faintly, as if drawn by the tension in the air. The moment stretched, sharp, with suspense as the audience held its collective breath, knowing that whoever acted now would change the course of the night. The girl's smirk faded, her eyes narrowing, the first flicker of uncertainty crossing her face as she realized that perhaps someone in the crowd was different from the rest. The chamber hung in silence, every breath from the audience caught in their throats, waiting to see who would break the uneasy stillness. And then from the back row a single paddle rose with a sharp motion, its soundless weight louder than any voice in the hall, and the announcer's eyes widened as he turned toward the unexpected bidder, a human named Adrian who had been silent through the entire evening, watching every lot with a calm detachment, as though none of it concerned him until this moment. And now, as the attention of hundreds snapped onto him, he remained steady, his gaze locked not on the crowd, not on the auctioneer, but on the alien girl who stood under the harsh spotlight with her restraints glowing and her defiant posture unbroken. And the way he looked at her was unlike the way anyone else had looked all night. Not with fear, not with hunger, but with something the audience could not name. A steady recognition that seemed to make the air heavier, and when the announcer cleared his throat and forced his voice to rise above the whispers, calling out the bid that Adrian had placed, a murmur of disbelief rippled through the chamber. For the human had not only offered the minimum but had doubled it outright, cutting through hesitation with a confidence that startled even the wealthiest. Traders present, and some scoffed while others leaned forward, intrigued by this lone figure who seemed untouched by the rumors of danger that had paralyzed the hall. But Adrian did not falter, his hand steady as he kept the paddle lifted, until the announcer slammed his cane against the platform, declaring the first official bid in a voice that tried to hide his relief. Yet no one else dared to counter, and the silence that followed was thick with disbelief, as though the entire chamber had been waiting for someone to challenge him, and yet no one did, because every eye that met the alien girl's defiant gaze quickly dropped again, unwilling to take that risk, and in that silence the announcer's voice rang clear. "Sold," followed by the sound of the gavel striking the podium, a sound that seemed to echo far longer than usual, as though the very walls of the auction house understood something significant had just been decided. And all at once the chatter resumed, louder and faster than before, a storm of voices speculating about the strange human who had just purchased the untamable one, some calling him a fool who had just thrown away his fortune, others whispering that perhaps he knew something they did not. And through it all Adrian rose from his seat, his face calm, his figure steady, moving against the tide of onlookers who parted for him with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. While on the stage, the alien girl tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing as she studied him, for though she had faced many masters and would-be captors before, there was something in this human stillness that unsettled even her. as if he was not claiming her as a prize but stepping into a challenge he had already accepted deep inside himself. And though her lips curved into the faintest hint of a smirk as the guards prepared to lead her away, that spark of curiosity in her expression did not fade because for the first time, she wondered whether the word untamable was about to be tested in a way she had not expected. And as Adrian approached the stage with measured steps, the crowd leaning closer to catch every detail, the announcer forced his practiced smile back onto his face and gestured broadly toward the pair, declaring with theatrical flair that the Untamable had finally been bought. But his eyes betrayed unease, for even he could not predict what would come from this strange pairing, and when Adrian stood before the girl, meeting her stare without flinching, the room fell quiet again, the restless audience sensing that though the auction was over, the true story had just begun. Adrian walked beside the guards as they led the alien girl down the narrow passage behind the auction chamber, the sounds of the restless crowd fading into the distance until only the low hum of the station's engines remained. And though the metallic corridors were lit with pale blue strips along the floor, shadows clung to the walls as though the place itself held secrets, and in the center of it all, the girl moved with chains that rattled softly, but could not disguise the strength. In her step, her chin high, her violet eyes sharp and unyielding, and Adrian, hands calmly folded behind his back, kept pace with her, as though the restraints did not exist, observing her not like an owner, but like someone searching for an answer, which made the guards exchange uneasy glances, for they had seen countless buyers drag their purchases with arrogance or fear. Yet this human walked as if he were simply accompanying an equal, and the girl noticed it too, flicking her gaze toward him with a flicker of surprise before masking it behind a thin smile that carried more challenge than warmth. And when they reached the secure chamber where contracts were signed and possessions were formally transferred, the guards hesitated as though reluctant to release her. But Adrian signed the documents without a word, his movements precise and steady, and when the final stamp sealed the transfer, he turned to the guards and asked them to leave, his voice calm yet carrying a weight that made them obey despite their reluctance. And once the heavy door slid shut, silence filled the room, broken only by the steady hum of the engines deep below. And it was then that the girl shifted her stance, pulling slightly against her restraints as she faced him fully for the first time, her eyes narrowing with curiosity and defiance, and her voice, smooth yet edged with steel, broke the stillness as she asked why a human, out of all the beings in the hall, would risk so much to claim her, for she had seen fear in countless eyes and anger in many, but never the steady, unreadable calm that he carried. And Adrian studied her for a long moment before answering, his tone quiet yet deliberate, saying that he had not come to own her, but to understand why no one else could, words that startled her more than she let show. For she had been told her whole life that she was untamable, that no one could hold her spirit, and yet this human did not speak of control but of understanding. And though she laughed softly, shaking her head as if mocking his choice, the sound held a faint tremor of intrigue she could not fully disguise, and Adrian did not react to her laughter, instead stepping closer with measured calm, placing a small control device on the table between them and sliding it toward her, the key to her restraints, and when she looked down at it, suspicion flickered in her gaze, for no one had ever willingly set her free. Yet he stood waiting, neither pressing nor retreating as though the decision was hers, and after a long silence she pressed her hand against the device, expecting some trick. But the restraints clicked open with a hiss and fell away, clattering to the floor, and for the first time in years her wrists were bare. Her freedom returned not through violence but by the choice of a human who had every right to keep her bound, and the sensation unsettled her far more than chains ever had, for freedom given was heavier than freedom stolen, and she took a slow step back, watching him carefully, testing whether he would lunge, whether he would command. But Adrian only folded his hands again and said that what came next was hers to decide. Words so simple and quiet they carried more weight than threats. And the girl, whose name was whispered, as Serenia in old legends but forbidden in many places, narrowed her eyes and asked him why he was not afraid, why he did not tremble as others did, and Adrian answered that fear was natural, but choice was stronger, that he had chosen to face her not as a master, but as a man who wished to see whether, The stories told about her were truth or a cage built by others, and his calm conviction stirred something deep within her, something she had long buried beneath anger and defiance. And though she did not show it fully, the faintest shift in her posture betrayed that her guard had weakened, if only slightly. And in that fragile silence between them, the hum of the engine seemed louder, the very walls of the chamber pressing in as though holding its breath, for the first true exchange between human and alien had begun not with chains but with freedom, not with commands but with choice. And though Serenia crossed her arms and smirked as if to brush off the moment, her eyes betrayed the flicker of a question she could not stop herself from asking. What exactly did this human want from her? And why, for the first time in her long, defiant life, did she feel that the answer might matter? Adrian guided Serenia through the quieter sections of the vast trade hub, where dim lights cast long shadows over rusted cargo crates and the distant echo of footsteps hinted at hidden watchers. Yet he moved as though the path was safe, his steady pace giving no hint of hesitation, and Serenia, now unbound, walked beside him with arms crossed and sharp eyes scanning every detail, testing whether this human would falter in her presence. Yet he did not, and the silence between them stretched until it felt like another presence, heavy and unspoken, broken only when she demanded to know where he intended to take her, her tone sharp but carrying a thread of curiosity. And Adrian answered without pause that his ship was waiting, a modest vessel compared to the grand crafts docked along the station. Yet it was his, and it would carry them far from the eyes that sought to use her as a prize. And Serenia tilted her head, lips curving in the faintest trace of amusement, asking why he assumed she would step foot on his ship, for she had no chain binding her now, no guard to enforce his will, and Adrian simply replied that he assumed nothing, that the choice remained hers, but that lingering in the station after such a public purchase would mean hunters and rivals would soon follow. And the weight of his words settled on her, for she knew the truth in them, and though she masked her agreement with a scoff, she did not turn away, instead matching his stride as they reached the docking platform, where his ship waited, a vessel neither new nor polished but sturdy, its outer hull marked by past journeys and quiet resilience. And as the ramp lowered with a groan, Serenia paused, her instincts flaring, for stepping aboard meant entering his world. Yet behind her, the murmur of voices carried faintly from the distant halls, the promise of pursuit already growing. And, with a sharp breath, she chose forward, her boot striking the ramp with a sound that echoed her decision, and Adrian, following close, sealed the hatch behind them, the hiss of the locks cutting off the outside world like a barrier against the storm. And within the ship the air was different, warmer, filled with the faint scent of metal and oil. A place lived in, not displayed. And Serenia's eyes darted across the narrow corridors, the flickering console lights, the hum of power thrumming beneath the floor, and she felt a strange unease, not from danger, but from the realization that here she was not a prisoner, not a display, but a guest in a space shaped by human hands alone. And Adrian moved with the ease of someone at home, settling into the cockpit and gesturing toward the co-pilot's chair, not commanding but offering. And after a moment's hesitation, she sat, her posture upright and guarded, but her eyes unable to resist scanning the array of controls, the faint glow of screens charting paths through stars. And as the engines roared to life and the ship lifted free of the station, she felt the shift of weight in her chest, the subtle change that came with leaving one world behind. And though she would not admit it aloud, a spark of anticipation flickered within her, for freedom unchained was one thing, but freedom to choose a path forward was another. And when the stars stretched into lines as the ship leapt into faster-than-light travel, Serenia turned to Adrian and asked what his true goal was, her tone calm but edged with suspicion, and he answered as steadily as before that he sought no prize and no power, only to see what truths existed beyond the stories told about her, that he wished to walk beside her rather than cage her, words that struck deeper than she expected, for no one had ever spoken to her so plainly, without fear or desire, and for a fleeting moment she studied his face, trying to find deception, yet found only that same calm determination, and she leaned back, folding her arms with a half-smile that hid more than it revealed, muttering that humans were stranger than she had thought. And Adrian did not argue, only set the course toward a distant system, leaving her to sit in silence, her mind stirring with questions she had never allowed herself to ask. And though the hum of the ship was steady, an undercurrent of tension lingered, for both of them knew the galaxy would not let such an escape go unnoticed, that forces would already be moving against them. And while Serenia watched the stars slide past in endless streams of light, she felt something unfamiliar, an unease, not born from chains but from choice, the quiet fear that perhaps this human was offering more than freedom. Perhaps he was offering the one thing she had never been prepared for, a chance to belong. As the ship cut through the fabric of hyperspace, its steady hum vibrating through the narrow corridors, Serenia sat with her eyes fixed on the passing streams of light, her mind calculating every possibility, for she knew that no matter how far they leapt, the galaxy had long ears and watchful eyes, and those who had desired her as a prize would not rest easily now that a human had walked away with the final lot. And even as Adrian adjusted the navigation with calm precision, his gaze occasionally flicking to the sensors, he felt the tightening coil of pursuit already forming behind them, a chase not yet visible, but inevitable, and Serenia, sharp and restless, leaned forward to study the readouts, her brow furrowing as faint signals emerged on the edges of the scanners, ships slipping into their wake, shadowy markers that grew bolder with each passing moment, until she spoke, her voice low and certain, telling him that the hunters had begun, that no ordinary escape route would hold them off for long, and Adrian, though his jaw tightened, did not panic, instead shifting the controls with steady hands, rerouting their trajectory toward a less traveled system, a path marked by hazards and unstable passages, a place most pilots avoided, but Serenia only raised a brow, realizing he was either braver than most or more reckless, and she wondered which would prove true when the chase reached its peak. Yet even as she weighed his choices, a flicker of something stirred in her chest, for this was the first time in many cycles that she was not being dragged or displayed, but rather fleeing into the unknown, with someone who seemed to carry no fear of her reputation. And as the ship's engines roared, breaking across the boundary into a cluster of asteroids drifting like a silent sea of stone, the first of the pursuers broke through the edge of hyperspace, sleek crafts built for speed, their outlines sharp, like knives against the stars, and the tension in the cockpit grew heavy as alarms blinked crimson across the panels. The chase now no longer a possibility, but a reality, and Serenia turned to Adrian with sharp eyes, asking if he had weapons aboard, to which he replied that the ship carried defense, not offense, enough to shield them but not to wage war. And her lips curved in a half-smile that was both mocking and admiring, for she had expected no less from a human who spoke of walking beside her rather than controlling her. Yet she knew survival demanded more than defense, so she rose, her movements swift and fluid, vanishing into the inner corridors as Adrian struggled to keep the ship weaving through the asteroid field, his hands steady even as boulders the size of cities drifted past, shadows rolling over their hull. And then a hum filled the ship, deep and resonant, a sound not from the engines but from Serenia herself, as she stepped back into the cockpit, her eyes glowing faintly, her hands pressed against the wall as if the metal itself listened to her, and Adrian felt the ship respond in ways he had never coaxed from it, the engine surging stronger, the shield shimmering brighter, as though her presence awakened something hidden within the vessel, and for a brief moment the hunters behind faltered, their sensors disrupted by the sudden surge, their formation breaking, and Adrian seized the chance, driving the ship deeper into the labyrinth of rock, his movements daring, threading through gaps that seemed impossibly narrow, the hull scraping sparks as stone brushed against it, but Serenia's hum wove with the ship, guiding it, steadying it, until the vessel felt less like a machine and more like a living creature moving through the void. And behind them the hunters pressed closer, their weapons lighting up the darkness with streaks of plasma. But each shot that neared was bent, deflected, or shattered against the sudden strength of their shields. And Adrian, though sweat traced his brow, could not hide the flicker of awe as he glanced at Serenia, realizing she was not only untamable but perhaps the key to a survival he would never have achieved alone. Yet even as he marveled, Serenia's eyes tightened, for she felt the strain, building within her, the ship drinking from her energy like a thirsty well, and though she bore it without flinching, she knew it could not last, that the hunters would adapt, and indeed they did, splitting their formation, circling around the asteroid field to cut off escape, forcing Adrian into a tighter and tighter spiral. And for the first time since leaving the auction, Serenia felt the sharp edge of uncertainty cut through her resolve, not fear of the hunters but of the path she had chosen when she stepped onto his ship. And she looked at Adrian, calm at the helm even as death pressed in, and a strange thought crossed her mind, that perhaps this human was more dangerous to her than any cage, not because he bound her but because he gave her a reason to fight beside him. And with a sharp breath she pressed her palms harder into the wall, her voice rising in a tone that resonated with power. And the ship surged forward with such force that the stars themselves blurred, leaving the hunters stumbling in their wake. Unable to match the burst, and as silence returned broken only by the fading alarms, Adrian eased the controls, guiding them out of the field, and Serenia withdrew her hands, her glow fading, her breath unsteady though her face betrayed no weakness. And she leaned back in her chair, her words quiet but firm as she told him the hunters would not give up, that this was only the beginning. And Adrian nodded, his gaze steady, his voice calm as he answered that then they would be ready for what came next. And though no chains bound her, Serenia felt the weight of something heavier than restraint settle within her, the realization that she was no longer merely untamable. She was now a part of a fight she had never chosen. And yet, deep within, she wondered if this fight was finally her own. When the ship finally steadied beyond the asteroid field, its engines humming at a softer rhythm as it drifted into the calm expanse of uncharted space, Adrian allowed himself a brief moment to breathe, though the tension of pursuit still lingered in his chest like an echo that refused to fade. Yet as his hand moved to adjust the navigation toward a quieter sector, Serenia's sharp gaze shifted from the stars to him, her silence heavier than words. For she knew the questions he had not yet dared to ask, and after a long pause she broke it herself, her voice steady though threaded with something ancient, telling him that what he had witnessed in the asteroid field was not merely instinct or will, but a fragment of the power that had made her untamable to all who sought to claim her. And Adrian, though weary from the chase, leaned back, his curiosity unshaken, pressing gently for her to explain. And so she began, not with pride but with a cool detachment, recounting how long before humans even stepped beyond their first star, her people had been guardians of forgotten currents woven into the galaxy itself, rivers of energy that few could touch without being destroyed. Yet she was born with an affinity not to be consumed but to shape it, to channel it. A gift that frightened even her own kind, for in the wrong hands such a being could become a weapon capable of bending entire fleets. And as she spoke, the faint glow that had sparked in her eyes during the pursuit flickered again, casting sharp shadows against her features, reminding Adrian that he was sitting beside a force that defied every chain forged for her. But what unsettled him more was the quiet note beneath her words, for she was not boasting of power, but warning him of the weight it carried. And with a bitter edge she revealed how her capture had not been chance but betrayal, orchestrated by factions who feared her existence yet refused to end it, choosing instead to sell her as a prize to be controlled, tested or destroyed depending on the buyer's will. And as Adrian listened, his jaw tightened, not in fear of her but in anger at the cruelty of those who reduced her life to a spectacle. And Serenia caught the shift in his expression, tilting, her head as if puzzled by the lack of fear, asking him if he understood what it meant to stand beside someone hunted, not only for what she was, but for what others believed she could become. To which Adrian replied, his voice calm but firm, that he understood more than she thought. For humans too had been underestimated once, treated as insignificant by greater empires until they proved otherwise. And though his words were steady, Serenia's gaze lingered on him with something unreadable, for she had expected doubt, perhaps even distance, but instead found conviction, and it unsettled her more than hostility ever could, for it pressed against the walls she had built within herself, walls that had kept her untouched by hope. Yet now cracks formed, thin but undeniable, and to steer the conversation away, she stood, moving toward the observation window where stars stretched like frozen rivers of light, her posture rigid as she confessed in a quieter tone that the hunters would never stop, because she was more than untamable. She was a key, and though she did not reveal to what, the weight of her voice carried the truth that it was no mere metaphor, and Adrian, sensing her hesitation, did not demand the rest, for he knew some truths revealed themselves only when trust was earned. Yet his silence did not erase the tension between them, a fragile balance of caution and growing reliance. And as the ship drifted deeper into uncharted space, faint ripples stirred across the sensors. Anomalies not of natural origin, but patterns too deliberate, too precise. And Serenya's expression hardened as she recognized them, whispering a name Adrian did not understand, but that seemed to chill the air between them, for she explained that these were not hunters of ships or traders of flesh, but watchers of the hidden currents, ancient entities who had once stood with her people and then vanished into secrecy. And if they were here, then it meant the galaxy's deeper currents had already shifted against them, pulling them into a storm far larger than an auction or a pursuit. And Adrian, though the weight of her revelation pressed heavily upon him, did not flinch, instead adjusting the ship to follow the faint trails, choosing to step willingly into the unknown, for he reasoned that running blind only gave power to those who hunted in the shadows. And Serenya, watching him take the course, wondered again what kind of human would risk walking willingly into currents even her kind had feared. And though she said nothing, a flicker of something almost like respect sparked in her eyes, though buried beneath layers of restraint. And as the ship edged closer to the anomaly, the stars themselves seemed to warp, folding inward as though space resisted their passage, and Serenya raised her hand, pressing it gently against the wall, her glow returning, softer this time, a resonance that steadied the ship as though she soothed the very fabric of reality. And Adrian, watching her in the dim light, realized that the revelation she offered was not just of power or betrayal, but of a choice that now bound them both, for whatever lay ahead was no longer her burden alone. And though the silence of space pressed around them, it was filled with the weight of everything left unsaid, the promise of truths still hidden, and the shadow of trials yet to come. As the ship drifted deeper into the distortion that bent the stars like liquid glass, the air itself seemed to hum with unseen tension, every console flickering with readings that made no sense to human technology. Yet Serenya moved with an uneasy familiarity, as though she had expected this moment and dreaded it at the same time. And Adrian, gripping the controls, felt the subtle pull of something beyond navigation, a current tugging not at metal but at will itself, drawing them toward a vast shape forming in the void. Not a ship, not a station, but a structure older than any design he knew, a labyrinth of floating stone and light interwoven like a cathedral. Adrift in space, its surface alive with shifting patterns that seemed to breathe. And as they drew closer, Serenya's guarded expression shifted into something rare, fear, though quickly buried under resolve, as she told Adrian that this was one of the hidden sanctums of the Watchers, beings who had once stood at the edge of the great currents but now turned into silent keepers of forgotten truths, and that entering meant there was no turning back, for the currents would either accept him or break him. And Adrian, though he heard the weight of her warning, did not pull away, instead guiding the ship forward until the vessel was caught by invisible hands of gravity that settled them into a chamber bathed in pale light, where silence stretched heavy, as though the very air was listening. And when the hatch opened, Adrian stepped onto the platform beside Serenya, the air dense with energy that pressed against his chest, making every breath feel earned. And from the shifting walls emerged forms not entirely solid, silhouettes shaped from streams of light, neither flesh nor machine, voices echoing without, mouths addressing Serenya first as the Unbound, their tone both reverent and stern, reminding her that her existence had never been meant for chains or auctions, but for a choice that could alter more than her own fate. And then their attention turned to Adrian, studying him as though stripping away every layer of his being, their voices overlapping with questions unspoken yet felt. Why had a human risked pursuit, danger, and the unknown for one who was not of his kind? And Adrian, though he felt the weight of their scrutiny, stood steady, answering not with grand speeches but with simple honesty, that he could not walk away when he saw chains placed on someone who should never have been bound, that humanity itself had once been overlooked and underestimated, and he would not repeat the mistake of standing silent when faced with injustice. And for a long moment the chamber trembled as though the sanctum itself debated his words. And Serenia, watching him, felt a strange unease. For she had expected resistance, excuses, even fear, but instead he stood with a conviction she had seen in no other, and it pressed against the walls she had built within herself. And the watchers, their forms flickering brighter, declared that the choice lay not with them but with her. For her gift, her burden, her untamable will could either remain her own or be shared with one who chose to stand beside her. But if she accepted, the bond would draw them both into the deeper currents where survival meant surrendering to forces beyond imagination. And Serenia, silent for a long time, looked at Adrian, the faint glow of her eyes softer now, and asked if he truly understood what he was stepping into. That it was not a rescue, not a debt, but a binding path that would mark him forever. And Adrian, though the enormity pressed heavily against him, nodded without hesitation, answering that understanding every detail was not as important as choosing not to abandon what was right. And in that moment the chamber blazed with light, currents spiraling like rivers around them, and Serenia stepped closer, placing her hand against his, the glow of her power flowing between them, not consuming but weaving, as though the currents themselves tested their union. And for a heartbeat Adrian felt himself dissolve, his thoughts scattered across endless stars, visions of civilizations long gone and wars yet to come flashing before his mind. And though the weight was unbearable, Serenia's presence anchored him, steady and unyielding, and when the light receded they stood still joined, the watchers silent yet watching, their judgment unspoken but clear, for the sanctum did not reject them, and Serenia, her voice low, whispered that the choice had been made, not by destiny but by will, and Adrian, though exhausted, smiled faintly, realizing that in choosing not to turn away, he had stepped into something far larger than either of them. And as the sanctum's light began to fade, the watchers spoke one final time, warning that currents once awakened could not be stilled, that powers hidden for ages would now stir, and that those who hunted would come stronger than before. And yet they ended with words that struck like iron. Together you may stand where alone you would fall. And with that the chamber released them. The ship lifted once more into the starfield, no longer drifting aimless but carried by the unseen flow of deeper paths, and Serenia, seated beside him, no longer carried the look of one alone in the universe. For though the storms ahead promised danger greater than anything they had faced, there was now a quiet bond forged in choice. And as the stars stretched, before them like endless doors yet unopened, Adrian knew that the untamable girl had never needed a master, only an equal who chose to stand beside her. And in that truth, the beginning of something greater had just taken root.